regardless of the media source or news source, we know that we can play with statistics and kind of make them say what we want them to say. So the Coke plague story that came out in 1986, I think, does a pretty good job illustrating exactly what we can do to incite a moral panic, or what the media can do to skew the data a little bit to show their story. So this was an interesting one about cocaine usage, and this came out, and the authors suggested that there's this huge cocaine binge, that everyone's using this drug and it's going to be a huge problem. And some researchers in 1993 published this sort of paper in Social Problems in 1993, kind of showing exactly how they went about skewing the, not necessarily skewing the data, but presenting it in such a way to blow out of proportion this cocaine binge plague that was going on. So if we look at the actual data that they use, there's a couple things that we should take away from this. So it is actual data. There's nothing wrong with the data per se, but the way that they use it is sort of interesting. And what we have is a lifetime prevalence. So on the x-axis at the bottom, we have, it's from 75 to 85, meaning from year 1975 to 1985. And up the y-axis on the left, we have the percent that have ever used cocaine. So this is any time in their life. So lifetime prevalence, you can see at the bottom right-hand side of the graph, means that doesn't mean that they're current users. They could have used one time. They could have used a million times. We don't know. It's just, have they ever used cocaine at some point in their life? And it ranges from a low about 9% in 1975 to this big, huge explosion in 1985 of about 17%. So what they do to kind of contextualize this is cut out this sort of increase that we see from 1975 to 1979 and only focus on the 80s, so the past 5 years, because they wanted to make the point that it's this recent Coke plague that is now part of the United States. So the editorial decision here was to delete or cut out this large increase in the late 1970s. So right there, they've already cut out the foundation or the context of the data. So you can see at the right-hand side, the Newsweek plague now is the black part of the graph, and it's the truncated data that they used. And all this other data is now censored, meaning that we don't even see it. So how do you contextualize something that you can't see? So now they kind of tinkered with a figure. So they didn't mess with the data, but what they did was they made a quote-unquote finer Y scale, making this increase look really large. And if we went back to the other graph, you could see that it ranged, but now they're only looking at, for percent ever used cocaine, from 14% to 18%. So only a 4% range in here. So again, we see this Newsweek plague that looks pretty big, but even at its lowest point in time, it's just a bit under 16. At its highest point in time, it's just a little bit above 17. So maybe at most a percentage and a half increase, but it looks big because the y-axis is now blown out of proportion. So now they did a little bit more tinkering with this, and they added a sort of a 3D depth to make this increase look a little bit bigger, and then all of a sudden they've called this the plague. So this is the final stages of the construction, ranging from 1980 to 1985. And now the y-axis is only from 15% to 17%. So any change is going to look huge because you only have 2% range in here, and even slight blips in the data that could be nothing more than sampling error are just going to look big. So the data that they used, the original data, is at the top left here, and what it actually came to look like in the media source is at the bottom right here. So you can kind of see, wow, we're missing a lot here, and we can't contextualize this story at all. If we look at actual cocaine users. This is from Monitoring the Future, and it's of 12th graders. So it's sort of an older population, older school population, and they looked at the same 5 years from 1980 to 1985. And for current users, not lifetime users, but people that are currently using cocaine, the percentages are much, much lower. It ranges from a little bit over 5 in 1980, from just below 7 in 1985. So at most, a 2% increase, if that. And you can see that there's already some blips there where it goes down in 82 and 83 and goes back up a little bit in 84, 85. And that's just the wave of the data. There's nothing here that would suggest an epidemic or a huge increase. It's just small deviations or blips in the data. So we can actually see that the type of data that we use and the way that we transform the presentation of the data really can change perceptions, and which it did in the 80s, right? There was a crack epidemic where we thought that drugs were a huge concern and a huge plague on communities. And it's not to say that drug use is not a problem, that we should condone it or legalize all. Well, you can extrapolate whatever you want from the data, but from a purely empirical standpoint, there's little to suggest that there was an actual huge increase, or certainly not an epidemic, of crack use. And this is where it gets kind of interesting. And you write about this in your book. If you look at surveys to ask people in the United States what is the most important problem facing the country, a lot of times drugs has been said to be the most important. Right now it's dropped down below. Things like terrorism are more problematic in the eyes of the country than drugs. But what we see is the number of essays in the media, as they increase, the more people think it's a problem. So forget actual drug use. That actually has hardly any bearing on whether or not people think that drug use is bad or not, or is a problem or not. It really almost has to do purely with how the media depicts drug use. If the media says it's increasing and there's a lot of stories on drug use, then people think it's more of a problem. So what's interesting, and you can probably extrapolate this to many other types of criminal justice issues, whether or not crime is increasing, or drug use is increasing, or sexual victimizations or murders are increasing, the real empirical data is not what matters. What matters is how it's perceived in the media. And if the newspapers and news stories are saying that it's a problem, or they're covering it more, they're going to think that it's a problem. They, meaning the United States population, all of us, is going to think it's a problem. And we can see that because crime has decreased dramatically recently, but in surveys, people tend to think that it's going up because, as we know, the media covers crime. So what we get from the media is this small public perception of crime. All crimes, we know that most crimes are not reported to the police. Only about 50% come to the police attention in the first place, and only a small portion of those get reported in the news. So what we get as society is certainly not a picture of all crimes. We're only getting a depiction of crimes that become known to the police, and only a small portion of that small portion is coming to the public. So what we judge crime off of is certainly not the true picture of crime. It's the small filtered number of crimes that we actually start to see from the media.